She was 20, and she had just been given the old servants' hall at Ashcombe Hall as her share of her father's estate. A long, whitewashed room above the coal cellars with a chipped stone floor and a stove that no longer drew. No parlor, no bedchamber upstairs, no income from the tenancies, just a folded page from her uncle's solicitor and a set of keys that opened nothing worth opening. And with that portion, Jane Grey walked into a house full of people who were counting on her silence. But sealed inside the plaster of that shabby, forgotten room, her father had left behind something that would undo every calculation they had made against her. Settle in with a cup of tea, and if you love a quiet English story of patience and hidden justice, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. To understand why the old servants' hall was given to her, one has to understand what Jane Grey had been before her father died, and what the family had never quite forgiven her for. She had been born at Ashcombe in the spring of 1848, the only child of Edmund Grey, a mild, scholarly man who had inherited the estate through his mother's line, and who cared far more for his library and his tenants than for the polite society of the county. Her mother had died of a fever when Jane was 4, and after that Edmund raised her almost alone, taking her walking through the beech woods on Sunday afternoons and letting her sit on the arm of his chair while he read Latin aloud to himself and forgot she was there. From him she learned to read anything set in front of her, to keep an account book in a straight column, and to distrust flattery, which he said was the one thing gentlemen were most often bought with. But the deeper part of her education came from Mrs. Anne Whitcomb, the housekeeper at Ashcombe, a widow of nearly 60 when Jane was a child, with iron gray hair pinned tight beneath a plain lace cap and hands roughened from 40 years of scrubbing, mending, preserving, and pressing linen. Mrs. Whitcomb had come to the hall as a scullery maid in 1810 and had risen slowly, without complaint, through every station of the house, and by the time Jane was old enough to trail her through the pantries, she knew every hinge, every damp corner, every draught, every board that groaned beneath a foot. She taught Jane how to render lard and how to whitewash a wall properly, working the brush in one direction only, how to mend a torn sheet with a rolled hem so fine you could not feel it under your thumb, how to make an ointment for chapped hands out of beeswax and sweet oil, how to sit still in a room and listen to a house until it told you where its trouble was. She spoke little, and she never petted the child. But she once told Edmund, when he came into the still room and found Jane at 9 years old skimming cream with a wooden ladle, that this girl saw things most grown women missed, and that he ought to teach her the estate books. Edmund did teach her. From the age of 12, Jane sat with him in the library on quarter days and copied out the rentals, marking each cottage and field, learning the names of every tenant and the acreage they held and the arrears they carried and the reasons for those arrears. She learned that Mr. Peake at Lower Combe paid late because his wife had been ill, and that Widow Selby at the mill was never to be pressed, and that the small orchard at the back of Ashcombe belonged, by an old family settlement, not to the hall proper, but to whichever child of the house was named in the deed. These were not things she was expected to remember. She remembered them because she had been taught to. She had also been given, on her 10th birthday, a small silver thimble that had belonged to her mother, engraved on the rim with the letters A.G. for Anne Grey, and Jane wore it on a plain ribbon around her neck when she sewed, and kept it in a folded scrap of blue velvet at all other times. It was the only thing of her mother's she owned outright, and it had traveled with her through every year of her life so far, warmed against her palm when she was frightened and turned over between her fingers when she was thinking. Her father had told her once, quite seriously, that a thimble was a working woman's crown, and that she should wear it whenever she felt she had been made small. She had been made small often enough. Her uncle Marcus Gray, Edmund's younger brother, had never approved of his brother's household, nor of Edmund's insistence on educating his daughter as though she were a son. Marcus lived in London on an allowance and a dwindling patrimony, and he had married a woman named Hester, who was fond of drawing rooms and unfond of country nieces, and their son Roland, a young man of 24 with soft hands and a hard mouth, had been raised to consider Ashcombe as effectively his own the moment his uncle should die. They visited seldom while Edmund lived, and when they did, they treated Jane with the distracted courtesy owed to a governess. She had, at 18, spent a season under Hester's chaperonage in town, and had returned to Ashcombe within a month, telling her father plainly that she preferred the Beechwoods and Mrs. Whitcomb's kitchen to any drawing room in London. He had laughed and kissed the top of her head and said she was more his daughter than he had dared to hope. Then, in the January of her 20th year, Edmund Gray took a chill riding home from a tenant's cottage in the sleet, and within 9 days he was dead. Mrs. Whitcomb herself washed and laid him out, and Jane sat with the body through the second night, holding the thimble in her closed fist, and did not weep where anyone could see her. The funeral was quiet, attended by the vicar and the tenants and a handful of neighbors, and Marcus and Hester and Roland arrived from London by the afternoon coach in mourning clothes, so new the creases still showed at the sleeves. They stayed on at the hall afterwards without being invited, and within a fortnight of the burial, a solicitor named Mr. Prewitt came down from town with a valise full of papers, and asked to speak with Miss Gray privately in the library that had, until so recently, been her father's. Mr. Prewitt was a small man with a neat beard and a habit of keeping his eyes just below the level of the person he addressed, and he arranged his papers on Edmund's desk with the care of a man who did not wish to look up from them at all. Marcus stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, and Hester sat in the wing chair near the fire in a bombazine gown, and Roland leaned against the bookcase eating an apple he had taken from the sideboard. Jane had understood, walking into the room, that the privacy Mr. Prewitt had requested was not to be observed. She sat in the chair he indicated and folded her hands in her lap and waited. The solicitor cleared his throat and read, in a level voice, from a document he described as the last testamentary instrument of the late Edmund Gray, dated the 9th of March in the previous year and lodged with his London office. By its terms, he said, the estate of Ashcombe, with its hall, its lands, its farms and cottages and rents, together with all moneys invested in the 3%, passed in trust to Marcus Gray as next heir male, with a life interest to devolve upon Roland Gray thereafter. To Miss Jane Gray, only child of the deceased, was left the sum of £40 per annum for her maintenance, and, as a residence during her unmarried life, or until such time as she should quit the property, the apartments known as the Old Servants' Hall and the 2 rooms adjoining, above the coal cellars in the North Range. Mr. Prewitt did not look up when he finished. Marcus turned from the window and said, in a tone he had rehearsed, that of course dear Jane would find the arrangement more than generous, considering, and that the servants' hall was really quite spacious if one did not mind the situation. Hester observed that a single young woman could hardly require more, and Roland took another bite of the apple. Jane asked, without raising her voice, whether she might see the document. Mr. Prewitt hesitated, and Marcus said briskly that of course she might, in due course, once probate was concluded, and that these were not matters to be handled hastily. Jane looked at the solicitor and asked him whether the will was in her father's hand. He said that it was signed by her father and witnessed. She asked whether she might see the signature. He turned the last page toward her across the desk, keeping his fingers upon it. The signature was her father's, or something very like it, made in ink she did not recognize. She did not argue. She had learnt from Mrs. Whitcomb that a house did its worst work quietly, and that a person who wished to see clearly must first refuse to be hurried. She thanked Mr. Pruitt and rose, and she went upstairs to the bedroom that had been hers since childhood, and she took down from the wardrobe a small leather trunk that had once been her mother's, and she began, methodically, to pack. She packed 3-day dresses of gray and brown wool, 2 nightgowns, her mother's Bible, a pair of stout ankle boots, a shawl of dark plaid, her work box with its needles and threads, a small bundle of letters her father had written her at school, and, in the folded scrap of blue velvet, the silver thimble engraved A.G. She left her books behind, all but one, a copy of Cowper's poems her father had given her at 15, with his initials on the flyleaf. In the passage outside her door, Hester's maid was already measuring the window for new curtains. Mrs. Whitcomb met her at the foot of the back stairs with a basket, and did not speak, and did not need to. Into the basket she had put a loaf of yesterday's bread, a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in muslin, a stone jar of dripping, a small twist of tea, a paper of sugar, a tallow candle and a box of lucifers, and a jar of the beeswax and sweet oil ointment she had taught Jane to make. She set the basket on the trunk and folded a clean apron across the top of it, and she put her rough hand for a moment against Jane's cheek. Jane pressed her own hand over it. Then Mrs. Whitcomb went back up the stairs to her duties, because there were still fires to be laid and dinner to see to, and neither of them would give the London Greys the pleasure of a scene in the passage. The old servants' hall lay at the far north end of the hall, reached by a stone stair that turned twice upon itself and smelt of coal dust and damp lime, and Jane carried her trunk down it herself in 2 journeys, one for the trunk and one for the basket, and she did not ask for help, and none was offered. The afternoon light came gray through the small square windows set high in the whitewashed wall, and the stove in the middle of the room stood cold, and the chipped stone flags rang under her boots. She set the trunk down against the north wall and the basket beside it, and she stood for a long moment in the middle of the room and looked. The hall was 30 feet long and perhaps 14 wide, with a low plaster ceiling crossed by 3 heavy oak beams gone almost black with age and smoke. The walls had been whitewashed many times, so many times that the coats had built up in soft ridges around the doorframe and along the skirtings, and in places the whitewash had begun to lift away in flakes the size of a thumbnail, showing yellowed plaster and, deeper still, the rough gray of lime and horsehair beneath. There were 3 small windows in the east wall, each with 4 panes of thick leaded glass, 2 of them cracked and mended with strips of lead. A door at the far end led to what had once been the servants' scullery, and now held nothing but a stone sink and a broken chair. Another door, low and narrow, opened onto a box room scarcely large enough for a bed. She walked the length of the room slowly, touching the walls as she went, as Mrs. Whitcomb had once shown her, letting her palm find the places where the plaster had gone soft with damp, and the places where it was dry and sound, and the places where the wall behind sounded hollow to a knuckle. She stopped once, near the middle of the west wall, where a section of plaster between 2 beams gave back a duller note than its neighbors, and she stood for a moment, with her hand flat against it. Then she went on. The light was going, and there was the stove to see to, and a bed to make out of what she had. And she had learnt, long ago, not to hurry a house that was ready to speak. She saw to the stove first, because Mrs. Whitcomb had taught her that a cold room was a room that argued with you, and a warm room was a room that let you think. She knelt on the stone flags in front of the little iron stove and drew out the ash pan and found it full of gray dust and a curl of blackened paper that crumbled at a touch. She carried the pan through to the scullery and tipped it into the sink and returned. She opened the flue with the small iron handle and heard, high above her, a faint clicking as something in the pipe shifted. She took a lucifer and a shred of muslin from her workbox and a few splinters of a broken chair rung she had snapped across her knee, and she made a small, careful fire in the belly of the stove, feeding it slowly until the muslin caught and the splinters caught after it, and a thin thread of smoke rose obediently up the pipe rather than falling back into the room. When it drew, she sat back on her heels and let out a breath she had not known she was holding. She made her bed on the box-room floor with the shawl folded double for a mattress, and her plaid folded again for a pillow, and she set her mother's trunk at the foot of it as a low table. She unwrapped the thimble from its blue velvet and set it on the trunk beside the copy of Cowper. She placed the loaf, the cheese, the jar of dripping, the tea, and the sugar on a shelf above the sink in the scullery, and she put the tallow candle in a broken saucer and lit it against the coming dark. Then she went back to the long room and stood with the candle in her hand and considered the walls. The room had, she saw, been used as a servants' hall until perhaps 30 years before, when the working household had shrunk and the newer kitchens off the south wing had taken over. There were the marks along one wall where a long refectory table had stood, and the pale rectangles on the plaster where framed prints or almanacs had hung, and a row of iron hooks by the door where aprons and cloaks would have been kept. In the northeast corner, a section of the flagstones dipped by half an inch, worn smooth by 50 years of feet coming in from the yard. In the southwest corner, someone had scratched, patiently, with a nail, the initials MB 1832. The room was not without its own history. It was only that nobody had thought to keep it. She lifted the candle and moved along the west wall until she found again the place her palm had found before, between the second and third beam, at the height of her shoulder. She rested her ear against the whitewash. She rapped, gently, with the flat of one knuckle. The sound came back short and dry, without the bright answering echo of solid lime. She stepped back and set the candle on the floor and looked up at the beam above and along the run of the plaster. There was, she saw now, a faint line, not a crack but a seam, running down for about 18 inches and turning at a right angle and running along for another 12, as if a small square panel had been cut into the wall and then plastered over so many times that the join had almost, but not quite, disappeared. She did not touch it that night. She went back to the stove, and to her bread and cheese, and to the box room, and she slept in her clothes with the thimble folded in her hand. In the morning she rose before it was light, drew water from the yard pump, washed her face at the scullery sink, drank her tea plain because she had no milk, and returned to the west wall with a small paring knife and a bradawl from her workbox and a length of clean cloth spread on the floor beneath. She worked patiently, as Mrs. Whitcomb had taught her to work whitewash, in one direction only, scoring the seam with the point of the knife and lifting away the built-up coats a flake at a time onto the cloth, so that no dust should scatter and no evidence of her labor show upon the floor when she was done. It took her the better part of 2 hours to clear a rectangle of plaster the size of a folded newspaper. Beneath the whitewash, the plaster itself was newer than the wall around it, softer, mixed by a hand less practiced, and behind the plaster, when she pressed with the bradawl, she felt not lime, but wood. She worked the plaster away with her fingers where she could, and with the knife where she could not, and she brushed the crumbs onto the cloth, and at last she uncovered a small square panel of oak set flush into the wall, no more than 10 inches across, with a beveled edge and a single brass keyhole set at its center. She sat back on her heels on the stone flags and looked at it. Then she took from around her neck the ribbon with her mother's thimble, and she took from the pocket of her apron the ring of keys her uncle's solicitor had given her the day before, keys that opened nothing worth opening, and she tried each of them in the little keyhole. None fitted. She thought for a long moment, sitting in the growing daylight from the high east windows, and then she got up and went to the trunk in the box room and lifted out the bundle of letters her father had written her at school. She had known, without knowing since she was a child, that her father kept a small key on the inside of the desk drawer in the library, taped there with a scrap of court plaster, and that he had once, laughing, called it the key to nothing in particular. She had not thought of it in years. She went now, quietly, through the still sleeping house, up the back stair and along the east corridor, and into the library where the fire had gone out, and no one yet stirred. She opened the desk drawer, reached beneath, felt the small, hard shape of the key under the strip of plaster, and drew it away with a small, careful tug. She was back in the servants' hall before the maids were up. The key turned in the little brass lock as if it had been oiled the week before. The panel swung open on a hinge of blackened iron, and behind it, in a shallow recess lined with lead against the damp, lay a folded oilskin packet tied with tape, a small canvas bag heavy in her palm when she lifted it, and, laid across the top of both, a single folded sheet of paper with her name upon it in her father's hand. She read the letter first, sitting on the cold flags with her back against the wall and the packet and the bag untouched in her lap. It was dated the previous October, 6 months before Edmund's death, and was written in the small, clear hand she had known all her life. He wrote that he had grown uneasy in his brother's company that summer, that certain papers had been taken from the library and returned in a different order, that he had cause to believe a will drawn in his name would be produced in London, which was not the will he had signed. He wrote that he had therefore lodged the true instrument, together with the deed of the orchard settlement and a memorandum of the 3% held in trust for her, in the wall of the old servants' hall, where Mrs. Whitcomb had helped him work the plaster one wet afternoon when the house was empty. He wrote that he trusted Mrs. Whitcomb with his life and with Jane's, and that if Jane was reading this letter, it meant he had not lived to speak of it, and that she was to take what she found to Mr. Alfred Coles, solicitor of Bath, whose direction was on the enclosed card, and to no one else. He wrote that he loved her and that she was not to be afraid. Jane folded the letter, put it inside her bodice against her skin, and untied the oilskin packet. Inside were 3 documents on stout parchment, each folded in 3 and tied with red tape. The first was the true last will and testament of Edmund Gray, dated the 11th of June, 1867, witnessed by Mrs. Ann Whitcomb and by the vicar of the parish, the Reverend Josiah Barnes, in which the whole estate of Ashcombe passed absolutely to his daughter Jane Grey on her attaining the age of 21, with a life annuity of £80 to his brother Marcus and no interest whatsoever to Rowland. The second was the ancient deed of settlement pertaining to the orchard at the rear of the hall, naming the named child of the house as sole proprietor. The third was a memorandum, in her father's hand, and countersigned by his London banker, of £4,200 in 3% consols, held in trust to Jane's benefit. The canvas bag held 62 sovereigns and a small folded slip listing them. Jane sat for a long while with the papers on her knee. Then she got up, closed the panel, replaced the loose plaster she had lifted, and hung her apron across it. She washed her hands in the scullery sink, tied on her bonnet, and went down the back stair to find Mrs. Whitcomb. Mrs. Whitcomb was at the still-room table skimming a pan of milk. Jane spoke 5 words. Mrs. Whitcomb set down the ladle, dried her hands, took her cloak from the peg, and said the trap could be at the yard gate in a quarter of an hour if Jane could walk that far without being seen. Jane could. Ned Halloran, aged 51, groom at Ashcombe since he was a boy, drove them the 11 miles to the railway halt at Little Meaden without asking a question, only tucking a horse blanket over Jane's knees when the wind turned, and remarking twice that the mare wanted new shoes. At Little Meaden, Jane took the 2 o'clock train to Bath with Mrs. Whitcomb beside her, and the oilskin packet flat against her ribs beneath her shawl. Mr. Alfred Coles, 68, a small dry man with spectacles on a black cord, read the papers in silence for 40 minutes in his office in Gay Street, then rose, bowed to Jane, and said the matter was clear and would be settled within the month if she permitted him the honor. She permitted him. They slept that night at a temperance hotel in Bath, at a cost of 3 shillings and 6pence, and returned to Ashcombe the following afternoon by the same route. Jane went back to the servants' hall and did not speak of what she had done. The Reverend Josiah Barnes, 62, walked up from the vicarage on Thursday and sat with Marcus in the library for an hour, and on Friday a letter came from Mr. Coles by the London post, and on the Monday following a second solicitor arrived from town, and by the end of the fortnight Marcus and Hester and Roland were gone from Ashcombe with their trunks and their new mourning and Hester's new curtains, left folded on a chair in the passage. The forged will was set aside by consent, without scandal, on the strength of the witnessed instrument and the memorandum and the vicar's plain testimony. Roland did not write. Marcus wrote once, a stiff note about the annuity, and Jane instructed Mr. Coles to pay it quarterly and to add nothing to it. Then Jane began to work. She began where she stood, in the old servants' hall, because it was the room her father had trusted, and because Mrs. Whitcomb said a house was mended from its plainest room outward. She had the flue swept by a chimney sweep named Tom Jarrett, aged 40, of Combe Bottom, who charged 2 shillings and refused a third when she offered it, and who left behind a small, stiff brush for keeping the stove clear. She had the 2 cracked panes in the east windows replaced by a glazier from the market town, one Mr. Isaac Peel, 60, who came with his boy and his diamond and his lead strips and worked in the yard on a trestle while the boy passed him the small tools by name. She whitewashed the walls herself, working the brush in one direction, only as Mrs. Whitcomb had taught her at 9, and she paid a plasterer named John Rook, 44, to patch the ceiling where the beams had shrunk from the plaster and left cracks the width of a knife. Room by room, she moved outward through the north range and then the south. She had the slates on the stable roof relaid by a slater from Wells, one Peter Barlow, 38, who brought his own laths and copper nails and would not stop for dinner until the ridge was closed. She had the library chimney rebuilt from the flashing up by a mason called Henry Fell, 52, who stood in the drawing-room the morning he finished and told her the stack would outlast her grandchildren. She had the leaking pipe in the scullery mended and a new range fitted in the kitchen by a fitter from Bristol who charged £9 4 shillings and left a written guarantee for a year. She settled arrears with tenants where the arrears were honest and forgave them where they were not, and she went out in the trap with Mrs. Whitcomb on quarter days and sat in the parlors of Lower Combe and the mill and the 4 cottages on the ridge, and she wrote in a fresh account book in a straight column what was owed and paid and what was set aside. She cleared the orchard at the back of the hall herself, with a billhook and a pair of leather gauntlets, cutting out the dead wood and the suckers over 3 weeks in March, and she engaged a gardener named William Ash, 29, lately turned off from a house in Wiltshire, who came with a spade and a barrow and a canvas bag of grafts and stayed. She reopened the walled kitchen garden, which had been let go for a decade, and had the espaliered pears cut back and the box hedges retrained by Ash and by a boy from the village called Sam Pettit, 14, whose mother took in washing. She had the iron gate at the yard mended by the smith at Combe Bottom, one Robert Halloran, 47, brother to Ned, who forged a new hinge on the anvil and refused pay for it, and said her father had once seen his eldest boy through a bad winter with a barrel of flour. Mrs. Whitcomb stayed. She was too old now for scrubbing, but she sat in the still room, as she had always done, and kept the accounts of the kitchen and the linen press, and told the new housemaids where every hinge and draught in the house lived. Jane had a bell put in the still room for her, and a small stove of her own, and a chair with arms. Word went round the parish, as word does quietly. By the autumn of that first year, the people at the market at Wells knew Miss Grey of Ashcombe by sight, and the shopkeepers greeted her by name, and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Barnes, called on a Tuesday with a jar of damson preserve, and stayed for an hour. Jane took her share of the parish duties without display. She sat on the school committee in place of her father. She visited the sick with Mrs. Whitcomb's ointment of beeswax and sweet oil in a small stone pot in her basket, and she read aloud on Sunday afternoons at the almshouses in Combe Bottom, where old Mrs. Selby, 91, formerly of the mill, told anyone who would listen that Miss Jane had her father's voice and her mother's mouth. The house settled around her. The old servants' hall became her workroom. She kept her account books on a plain deal table by the east windows, and her mother's Bible and cowper on a shelf by the door, and the little oak panel in the west wall she left in place, cleaned and beeswaxed, the key hanging beside it on a nail. She took her breakfast there most mornings before going up to the main rooms of the house, and she wrote her letters there in the afternoons. William Ash brought her the first apples from the orchard in September, 6 on a wooden trencher, and she and Mrs. Whitcomb cut one open at the still-room table and ate it with cheese. Small rituals formed. On the first Monday of every month, Ned Halloran drove her to Wells and back for the market and the bank. And on the second Wednesday, she rode out with William Ash to look at the hedges and the ditches. And on the last Friday, she sat in the library with Mr. Coles's clerk, who came down by train from Bath and went through the quarter's papers. On Sundays, she walked to church across the beech woods and sat in her father's pew. And afterwards, Reverend Barnes shook her hand at the porch and asked after Mrs. Whitcomb. In the evenings, she wrote up her books at the deal table with a single tallow candle, as she had done that first night, because she had grown fond of the quiet quality of the light. On an evening in the second autumn after her father's death, when the beech leaves were beginning to turn and the smell of coal smoke lay along the lanes, Jane sat at the deal table in the old servants' hall with the account book closed under her hand and the candle burning steady in its broken saucer. She was 21 now, and by the terms of the true will, the estate had passed to her absolutely in the spring, and Mr. Coles had come down himself from Bath in a black coat to see the last of the papers signed at the library table where the false will had once been read. She had thanked him at the door and gone back down the stone stair to this room, because it was here she thought most clearly. She looked, as she sometimes did, at the small oak panel in the west wall, and at the brass key hanging beside it on its nail, and at the beeswaxed wood that gave back a soft, dull gleam in the candlelight. The recess behind it was empty now. The papers were lodged with Mr. Coles in Gay Street, and the 62 sovereigns had gone to pay the slater and the plasterer and the fitter from Bristol and the boy who had passed the diamond to Mr. Peel in the yard. But the panel stayed where her father had set it, because she had come to understand that it was not the papers that had saved her. It was that he had known, in the October before he died, that the room above the coal cellars would be the room she was given, and that she would be the one to find the seam in the plaster, and that Mrs. Whitcomb would meet her at the foot of the back stair with a basket and a folded apron, and would say nothing where anyone could hear. On the deal table beside the account book she had set out, that evening, the two small things that were the whole account of her belonging. Her mother's silver thimble in its folded scrap of blue velvet, engraved AG on the rim, given her at 10 and worn on a ribbon round her neck ever since, and, laid beside it, the small brass key that had opened the little oak panel, taken from the underside of her father's desk drawer, where he had once, laughing, called it the key to nothing in particular. Two objects from two people who had loved her without expecting anything back, and who had put into her hands, one at 10 and one at 20, the tools of an ordinary competence and a hidden inheritance. She thought of Marcus in his London lodgings on his £80 a year, and of Hester who had measured her curtains before the funeral was cold, and of Roland with his soft hands and his hard mouth, and she found she did not think of them long. Mrs. Whitcomb was asleep in her chair with arms in the still room below, and Ned Halloran was seeing to the mare in the yard, and William Ashe had left a basket of late plums by the scullery door. Jane Grey had been 20 and cast out of the house she was born in, with £40 a year and the old servants' hall above the coal cellars for her portion. She had a mother's thimble and a father's key to her name, and she had spent them on a room nobody wanted. It was the best inheritance she was ever given. If this story has stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and to share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what small thing, in your own life, you were once handed as a slight that turned out to be a door. We'll be waiting to read, everyone.